everybody. So in this PowerPoint, I'm going to go over Chapter 10, writing about setting an atmosphere. Very short PowerPoint. So, setting. The location in which the story takes place and the time in which the story takes place. So the time in which it takes place can tell us a lot about what we're supposed to get out of the story. You know, it might not be something that we're familiar with, but if we know a little bit of history, perhaps, then we might understand why characters are behaving in a certain way, or why events are transpiring in a certain way. And it's important to keep that in mind because, you know, there might be things that happen in a story that, you know, for a contemporary reader wouldn't make sense, or just we couldn't imagine something like that actually happening. But if we consider that it's taking place, you know, 100 years ago, then that can help us understand and relate to the story a little better. It can help us relate to the characters a little better. The location that it takes place in might do the same thing, might help us understand the characters a little better. Certainly, and we're not just talking about like geographic location, like what part of the world or what part of a certain country or even what part of a state, although that can be important. We're also talking about, you know, is it taking place in a house? Is the story taking place in a school? Is the story taking place in one room? Is the story taking place in, I don't know, an office building or a park? You know, those can have, the location can tell us a lot about why things are happening and why characters are behaving the way they are. One thing to ask yourself, you know, to figure out if the setting is super important is to consider whether or not the story could take place in another time, in another location, and it still be the same. And that can be true sometimes. Sometimes authors write about the human condition in a way that, you know, the story that they're telling us is universal and timeless. And therefore, when and where it takes place might not really matter. A lot of times, though, the setting does shed light on the story, on the characters, and on the theme. Especially if what might happen is the setting can create a particular atmosphere. Which would be like the emotional effect that the setting produces. And that can contribute to the overall meaning of the story. So if you think about, for instance, a story, and our main character is a madman. He's psychotic. He's a lunatic. Maybe just sociopath. If the author chooses to make the setting of the story in this, you know, really dark, damp, bone-filled catacomb, then that is going to create a definite feeling. We are going to feel a sense of horror or dread or foreboding. We're going to sense it. There might be confrontations or arguments between the characters that is spurred on by the setting, and that might create an atmosphere of tension. So the atmosphere in a short story is similar to what we learned about tone in poetry, except it's not, you know, because tone is more about the speaker. Atmosphere is more connected to the setting. and how things are described. And pay attention to, sometimes we can be in a really beautiful, lovely setting, but the description that the author chooses to use might contradict that beautiful setting. So the description, the specific word choices, might be word choices that we would, you know, that we would think of going with a really dark and sinister setting. So if there's a contradiction, if there's a contrast between the setting and the atmosphere that is being created by the imagery, pay attention to that. Most of the time, though, it's going to be that the description is going to fall in line with the atmosphere that the setting itself is creating. And that can tell us a lot about what we're supposed to think about the characters, what we're supposed to think about the plot and the climax, and it can tell us a lot about the theme of the story. So, obviously in the stories that we're going to be reading, we're going to look closely at setting and atmosphere, and we will see how important those elements are to each of the stories. And it might differ to some degree for each story. In some of the stories we read, the setting and the atmosphere might be super important. In other stories, it might be significant, but not ultra important. But I think you'll find that the setting and the atmosphere are worth looking at in each story, and something that we need to consider in order to get to the theme of the story. So, we'll be talking about them in great detail as we read each selection, but if you have any questions about setting and atmosphere right now, let me know. Otherwise, you guys are free to move on to the last PowerPoint on Chapter 11.